It's just to say, of course, that we are recording this, and Sarah has agreed to that, and that means we will be able to have that as a resource as well, that we will post up on the Gender and Sexuality Research Cluster. So it'll be available a couple of weeks' time, probably, when we've worked it through. So I'm Tracy Skelton. I'm the chair of the Gender and Sexuality Research Cluster, and we've been quite busy since we sort of kicked off with various things that we're doing. A couple of weeks ago, there was a talk by Kyunga Jung focusing on young women and feminism in South Korea. And her talk and the blog that's written by Veronica, who's one of the graduate students working with us on this research cluster, that's just been posted on the website for the research cluster. So do take, if you didn't manage to attend that session, then please do go and have a look at it and read the blog as well. We'll have one very similar in a few weeks' time for this session. So the Gender and Sexuality Research Cluster is delighted to host Associate Professor Sarah Smith, who works at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Sarah is a feminist geographer who's interested in the relationships between territory, bodies, and the everyday. She blends and analyzes how politics and geopolitics are constituted or disrupted through intimate acts of love, friendship, and birth. And she's worked in the Ladakh region of Jammu and Kashmir state in India for many years. She's a real expert on it, and I can tell you, because I've listened to her talk several times in other geographical places. Sarah has been very productive with her writing and research recently. So her first book, Intimate Geopolitics, Love, Territory, and the Future of India's Northern Threshold, was published last year, 2020, in March. And then she pronounces that her second book, Political Geography, A Critical Introduction, was published in April 2020. So that's two books published within 2 months of each other in the same year. And so it must be a great relief and a sense of pride as well to see that they're both published, and you can sort of tick that list off. So congratulations on that, Sarah. Sarah's work connects with the theme of the research clusters in several ways. So as a feminist, she's engaged a lot with gender, and of course, intimacy and love are often embodied through sexuality. However, her work has a very strong connection with two of our research themes, two of the research cluster themes, youth and society, and borders and boundaries. And when we were devising these themes and things, in the back of my head, right at the beginning, I was thinking, oh, Sarah would be great at this, particularly as we can bring the youth stuff and the borders and boundaries together. So Sarah will be drawing upon her book, Intimate Geopolitics, which is published by Rutgers University Press, and exploring territory, love, marriage, and global processes that inevitably bring change to the spaces and places and people of the Ladakh region. Sarah sorry, I can't read my own writing here. I'm just trying to work out. So Sarah is it's a very strong welcome. Sorry, that's what I'm trying to say. I'm sending you a very strong welcome that you've joined us. And thank you very much for starting your day so early and sharing your work with us. As our day draws to a close, and temporality and time create distance between us, but Zoom brings us together in place. So off we go. So Sarah, welcome, and please do what you need to do to get yourself ready for the talk. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks to Tracy and to the whole Gender and Sexuality Research Cluster for inviting me, and also to Andrew for being so patient with me on email. I'm really happy to be here, and I know it's your Friday night, so it's so kind of you to to be here on a Friday night with me. I'm sure you could find something more fun to do, but I will do my best to keep you from getting bored. And also I wanted to say you have such a lovely, there's so many great folks at NUS, so I really regret I can't be there in person. Like Tracy said, I'm going to speak today from my book, Intimate Geopolitics, Love, Territory, and the Future on India's Northern Threshold. And I tried to select ideas from it that would hopefully be helpful to the folks in the cluster. I start my book with a story of star-crossed lovers. Fatima and Paljor married. Fatima is a Shia Muslim and Paljor is a Buddhist, and their story played out here in this high altitude desert of Ladakh. I'll show a map in a minute, up on India's northern threshold where it meets Pakistan and China. The story began in Leh, Ladakh's capital, which you see here. And you see here the oldest part of Leh, and you see these houses where Muslim and Buddhist houses are very closely packed together and have been for many years. And then we're looking down on the Indus Valley. So you see the green in between the mountains down below is the Indus River. So I start my book with this love story talking about a lunch I had at Fatima and Paljor's house. But then by the second page of the book, Fatima has stopped me in the street in Leh and told me she's pregnant, Paljor's family won't let her see him, and she doesn't know what to do. She went on to have an abortion, the couple was separated and remarried to new spouses within their religious circles. But I end my book with a similar and different story. The story of Stanzin Saldan's marriage to Murtaza Aga, and you see this couple pictured here. In 2017, Stanzin Saldan, now calling herself Shifa, wrote an editorial in the Indian Express. And I'll just read a little bit from her editorial. So this is Stanzin Saldan's words in the editorial. She writes, "My name is Stanzin Saldan. I also call myself Shifa. I was born in a Buddhist family in 1987 in Leh. My personal decision to marry a Muslim man is being used to fuel communal tension across Ladakh. The Ladakh Buddhist Association wrongly claimed that the love of my life and my husband, Syed Murtaza Aga, has lured me to accept Islam. The LBA also gave an ultimatum to the Muslim community in Ladakh to return me or leave the region. Shifa had already written to the chief minister saying the LBA is trying to objectify me and demanding my return as if I'm a property, which I'm not and cannot allow anyone to perceive me as such. The LBA alleged Shifa had been kidnapped, but in an interview, she said she had been the one to propose marriage. She tells the interviewer, I was pinned down in a car crash in Delhi in 2015, and the only person I wanted to see was Murtaza. So she says this is when she decided to suggest they get married. Word of their marriage arrived in Leh in August of 2017, immediately leading to protest. Shifa and Murtaza left Ladakh and traveled without their phones, so they couldn't be found, through Kashmir. She writes, I was aghast to see my decision to marry a Muslim man from Kargil being shown as theft of a girl and a reason for the dying culture of Ladakh. Our culture and ethos, in fact, all cultures on earth, haven't dropped down from the sky where love and individual choices have no scope. That's the worst possible way for us to look at ourselves. The portrayal of a woman as a mere baby-making machine to save the community was another despicable reason to question my life choices. It's shameful to demand that I should be returned because no one has stolen me. So my work seeks to understand lived geopolitical life in Ladakh, which is now a Union territory. So as I was wrapping up the book, things unfolded differently in Jammu and Kashmir. So Ladakh, which you see right here, used to be two different districts, Kargil and Leh district within Jammu and Kashmir state. It's now a Ladakh Union territory. My work seeks to understand lived geopolitical life in Ladakh, which is this semi-autonomous region at India's northern border up in the Himalayas. The colonial legacy of the British and then partition laid the groundwork for Ladakhi Buddhists to demand autonomy from Jammu and Kashmir state, intensifying and taking on religious overtones, especially in the 1990s, alongside Hindu nationalism and Kashmiri struggles for autonomy. This book tells the story of embodied geopolitical repercussions of these events, in which the contested borders that you see on this map come to life in daily interactions. So in my overarching research agenda, I look at how people do tricks with time to claim and bound territory. I see that as sort of an overarching trend that brings several of the things I'm interested in together. And I have a little section at the end of my talk where I'll talk more broadly about a couple of these that aren't really featured in the book. So if we have time, I'll talk about those. I'm interested in how visions of the future, which I've theorized as generational vertigo, and I'll talk about that today, and demographic fever dreams, drive our geopolitical present. That is how embodied life is understood as a vector through which we manage the future of territory. The management of future territory is bound up in heteronormative and reprosexual family structures, in racialized and imperial processes that mark and bound not only land, but also our embodied life, and seek to contain the potential of an unruly future. So that's one of the reasons I work a lot with young people, because they're understood to be making our future territory, after like long into the future. So in my larger research agenda, I also theorize the future in relation to the Anthropocene as apocalypse. And that's work I've done with my former students and now colleagues, Mabel Gergen and Pavitra Vasudevan. And then I'm also now working on this idea of the scenes, like how we talk about the Anthropocene, Plantationocene, and Capitalocene, and how these ideas of the scenes are kind of made more anemic by their failure to include Black and Indigenous theorizations of time and space. So if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But for today, I'm going to talk about my book. And the book really starts with research that I started, I guess, in 2004. And it draws on a range of methods that I wanted to just mention. So one is a survey of about 200 women where I asked them about marriage and family planning. And then I've done about 120 semi-structured interviews over the years with some of these women. And then also more recently, I've mostly been talking to young people about their experience going to college, and there'll be more on that. A big chunk of the talk will be about that. And then I've done some short-term youth history and photo voice projects, and then 2 year-long collaborative photo voice projects. And the second one I did with Mabel Gergen, who was my graduate student and then a postdoc, and now she's in Asian studies at Vanderbilt University. So you see us there doing a workshop, or you see the back of our heads. then, then you see a young woman who you'll hear more from in a little bit. So in the book, I'm thinking about what does it mean to inhabit a geopolitical body? And I've made this kind of funny slide that's talking about some of the ways I think about that question in the book. So on the one hand, our bodies are this place through which we know the world. On the other hand, there's a kind of physics to bodies. And what I mean by that, I'm thinking about Arun Saldana talking about there being a physics to bodies and how they're racialized. I'm thinking about how bodies get kind of drawn together or pushed apart. And then bodies are, of course, managed as populations in this biopolitics sort of a way that folks would be familiar with. But these ways of thinking about the body, also bodies are understood as a territory, kind of territory upon which national identity or religious identity gets mapped and then contested. But then when I've been talking to folks in Ladakh over the years, I felt that these ways that our lived experience is written about doesn't really capture many of the stories I'm being told. So I felt that especially the ways that bodies get written in relation to territory really makes them seem like they don't have a life of their own, like bodies don't act upon territory. So one of the things that I focus on in the book is the way bodies kind of exceed their own bounds. So things like desire and love and affection and care for other people can also have territorial effects. And then the second one that I see folks talking about is bodies as a kind of our lived experience as a vector to the future. So then I think about territorial bodies in relation to sites of intimacy, so how close you are, not necessarily only in relation to like sexuality, but also like how close are you with your neighbors? And also I look at it through intermarriage, reproduction, how territory gets caught up in questions about how many babies you're going to have, and then in relation to youth. So I'm going to walk a little bit through each of the chapters of the book, and then I'm going to focus on the Generation Vertigo chapter. And before I move on, I just wanted to, this is the cover, and I just like to say how it was really fun to work with a Ladakhi artist, Chamat Dorje, and you can follow him on Instagram at spindle_art. And he was so generous to let me use some of his art for the cover. And he says that this piece, which is like cut up magazine pieces on a rice paper, is about, he was trying to think about the long-term past of Ladakh, where we always hear how the Himalayas were under the ocean and how they're kind of slowly still rising out of the ocean. So he was trying to think about Ladakh over this long scale of time. And the title of it is "The Mountains Are Our True Ancestors." So I like that because I'm thinking about temporality, and then that's in some ways what he's doing with this book. So it's the ocean in the middle of a mountain. So these are the chapters. So I'm going to go through birth in the territorial body first. Oh, I forgot I had this. So he had already, he had given this artwork away, but I really liked it. So his friends who had it kind of held it up and took a picture of it for me to use for the cover. If you go to Leh, you have to go to, he has a cafe that has art in it. Okay, I'm gonna try to focus here. So this is the main bazaar that I spoke to you about earlier. I'm gonna stay on this side. So I began this chapter with the story of a boy who's born in the wrong body because of a mother's selfish decision to use contraception. In the telling of her neighbor, so this is a story that somebody I call Nilza in the book told me, and she's told me this story a couple of times, and in relation to her own choices about contraception. So this is what I fleshed that out more in the chapter. So Nilza tells me that a boy showed up at the house of her neighbor demanding to be let in, saying, "This is my house, that's my zoo, like a farm animal. I wanted to come back and they wouldn't let me in." And Nilza explains to me that careless family planning has not only created precarity for the future of the Buddhist population, but also cast reincarnation into chaos. And she gives this example of that as a woman in the family using contraception, this boy then being born to the wrong family 100 kilometers away, and then showing up at the house demanding to be let in. Birth is the remaking of the world. It's a circulation of life through bodies and incarnation. It's the continuation or disruption of a lineage of ancestors, becoming more rooted in a place, becoming dispersed, or carrying a place to distant lands. Will the birth of children bring chaos and disruption? As the world is remade through birth, does it resemble the one we now inhabit? These questions are taken up in other languages across contexts, and I'll come to that at the end. So in 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is 200 miles from where I wrote this book, a crowd of white supremacists chanted, "You will not replace us, Jews will not replace us." An undercurrent travels across these contexts, the twinned ideas that bodies themselves carry a geopolitical charge and that an unrecognizable future must be avoided. In Ladakh, for the last nearly 20 years, a rhetoric of demographic fever dreams in which fear of Muslim population growth and its potential to shift electoral politics has been on the rise. And this has led to campaigns for Buddhist women to avoid family planning. Yet it remains very popular and widely used by both Buddhists and Muslims. So nearly everyone that I've spoken to wants 2 or 3 children because parents feel they can't afford to have more children. Everybody wants to send their kids to private schools. They want the best for their children. So there's a lot of talk about people not using contraception and having a lot of kids, but then I can't actually find these people who are having a lot of kids. So the next chapter is the Queen and the Fist Fight. And in this chapter, I talk about how intermarriage and babies came to be a way through which territory was contested. And I start by telling a story about in 2004, when I asked Hassan to tell me about politics, and he started talking about a 17th century story of a Muslim queen, Gyal Khatun, who married a Buddhist king, Jamyang Namgyal, and gave birth to Sengye Namgyal, who is one of Ladakh's most celebrated kings. But Hassan was telling me what I found interesting was I was asking Hassan about politics, and then he was telling me the story of a 17th century princess to tell me the story of the 20th century, and especially of his childhood when it was no big deal to marry somebody of a different faith. And he's telling me how that changed during the 20th century. Collective memory is evoked to tell the story that we need to tell today, that's necessary today. So this chapter starts with Gyal Khatun, and this is the Lay Palace up above. But then it comes to the 1990s when a fist fight breaks out on this street with people watching from the cafes up above. So I've heard multiple people tell me what they saw from the window of the cafe that they were in. So it talks about a fist fight between a young Buddhist and Muslim in the street beneath the palace, um, and kind of traces the history of the British carving up the subcontinent according to mappings of people marked as homogenous religious populations, and then how this comes to be understood as the way to govern. And I talk about that through the series of events that unfold after this fist fight. And the next chapter, I talk about intimacy. And in this chapter, I don't actually talk about like romance and, oh no, I do a little bit. I take that back. Maybe that's in all the chapters, but that's not all that I talk about. I can talk about other things. So I talk also about neighbors and neighborly relations and family relations. The arrival of a visitor at the gate sets in motion the making of tea with milk and sugar and searching for a package of cookies. The guest sits on a wool carpet, kind of noticing the quality of the carpet, making small talk as the host chooses a saucer and a cup reserved for guests. And somebody will fix you a thermos of butter tea that you see behind the table. And the host will keep giving you more salty tea with each sip so that it never gets cold. If you just want one cup, you just need to drink the whole cup pretty quickly and then really not let them fill your cup. You could cover it with your hand or even put it under the table if necessary. And then this crinkle of biscuit wrappers and the whooshing sound of the butter tea being churned, steam coming up from the cup, butter rising to the top as a golden liquid. All these little practices build familiarity over time. Sarah Ahmed tells us attachment takes place through movement, through being moved by the proximity of others. This movement is shaped by passing over the threshold of a house, whether permanently as a bride or groom or repeatedly over the years as a neighbor or family member. At what moments do these thresholds come to be proxies for other kinds of borders? When do they recede as unexceptional? How are the choices of the past reinterpreted, and what does this mean for the threshold of the future? Nizam, a prosperous Sunni trader now in his 80s, told me, my relatives are in the thousands. My whole family is Buddhist. My grandma was Buddhist. Most of our relatives are Buddhist. So how do we read Nizam's lyricism alongside the word of Nargis, a Shia woman also living in Leh? She told me the story of a time when Muslim homes were burned in the nearby village of Tikse. They were just thinking to put an end to Muslims. They said to get out, for the Muslims to get out. That's what they were saying. Where would we go? In Kashmir, there are Kashmiris. Where would we Ladakhis go? The older people would say, people who were born right here, telling them to get out. How can they get out? And I asked, why would they do that? She says, there are some who say the Muslims are taking all our girls. When Nargis talks about the fragmented 1989 attempt to exile Muslims from their natal villages, the burning of Muslim houses, including her husband's childhood home, slips into a possessive discussion of women's bodies. The Muslims are taking all our girls, as an explanation for expulsion for flames. Nizam's relatives in the thousands were formed through Lay's long history of intermarriage, through which affective, emotional, and practical ties were forged. Marriage is not between two people, but between many. Over time, these marriages create relatives in the thousands. Affective claims to belonging happen through marriage, through relationships that spiral across generations from a single marriage. And now we're going to shift and I'm going to start talking more about young people and children, mostly young people. So this is how I start the second to last chapter in the book, Raising Children on the Threshold of the Future. It's the end of a hectic day, and a talkative group of children and young people are crowded around a laptop. We're in the Ladakh Arts and Media Organization. So this is an organization that I've been working with since 2011. It's kind of my, apart from my actual family home in Leh, it's kind of a home away from home there. The young people have spent the day taking photographs in small groups, and now they're explaining images while friends interject. Some of the photos are staged for effect and telegraph their meaning really clearly. So little kids who wanted to tag along have been made to kind of pose as child laborers and then pose studying. And the teenage director of the photos explains that he wants a future in which all children go to school. In the light of these narratives, we arrive at this pair of images that I've put on the screen. Stanzen, up in the cap, has posed with Laytown, and behind him we see these like houses nestled together and the roof of a Buddhist temple. Then he has this picture of a memele. So memele is the word for grandpa. And he's wearing what everybody recognizes memele clothes. Maroon coats, a hand-spun and hand-woven wool robe reaching the knees, local wool hat, thick coat in summer, and blue sneakers. Everybody has a memele like this. Stanton is kind of shy, so other kids start calling out suggestions saying, Stanton stands in for the future, Stanton's the future, he's our youth, he's modern, and memele is the past. But then Stanton interrupts the other young people and he says, no, this is me in the present. In the future, I will be like memele. That's the meaning of these photographs. Why did we, the students who called out and me as well, see Stanton's baseball cap and big smile and think future and place memele in the past? After all, we're all right there in the present. These photos were taken today. Why do we play these tricks with time and space, and what do they accomplish? Why did none of us guess that when Stanton saw memele, he saw his own future? Instead, attention had focused almost exclusively on change. When a young man took a picture of two young women in skinny jeans and sweatshirts holding notebooks, he explained that this is what modern girls are like, stylish and studious. Here, his tone was clearly admiring. Yet this team also posed young Ladakhi girls in traditional Ladakhi dress, like a bulk, a satin cape. The valuation of studious women in skinny jeans and the importance of local fashion is not in conflict but complementary. In this chapter, people young and old play with time to do political and cultural work, often by projecting people and events either backward in time or forward in time. Okay, so this is the kind of last chapter, and I'll talk a little bit more about it relative to the other ones. Oh, I put this image. Okay. So in this chapter, I have this idea of generation or generational vertigo, kind of how the future is seen as this unknown and how folks try to navigate it. And I wanted to say just a little bit about the image before I go on. So this is the artist Tashi Namgyal, who is also on Instagram under his name. And you see him on a bicycle and a t-shirt. And he's made this cool image for our zine. I should have mentioned that I will mention actually that we one of the things that Mabel and I did as we made a zine, like a handmade magazine with a group of young people using their images, and also we made copies of old photographs that they brought from their homes, and we all made this zine together about their life going to college, going from Ladakh to college and their experiences there. So this chapter is going to be more about that. So here, Tashi Namgyal, who you see wearing the t-shirt, has put together an image of him and then his father, when his father was his age, also on a bicycle, also studying outside Ladakh, and then his grandfather, who is weaving this sepo, a traditional basket that you would see in any village. And he's made these lines to show that he feels like he and his father can understand each other, and his father and his grandfather can understand each other, but he and his grandfather can't really understand their lives or their life choices in the same way. Whoops. So this is one of a series of images from this zine, and you can see one page of the zine here. And I'm going to talk about Stanton Jide, who I call Kunzas in the book, but she actually is okay not using a pseudonym. So you see her with this kind of cool hair color in the bottom. Kunzas is telling about her experience at Delhi University. Confident hand gestures underscored her assertions. You guys have to understand, I'm a feminist, okay? Kunzas's college, Miranda House at Delhi University, is known for its feminist orientation, and Kunzas has completely embraced this vision. Projected on the screen behind her, we see her smiling face with stylish glasses and hair bleached in a trendy ombre style. Her friends' faces are radiant in the background. It's the kind of photo that you unintentionally smile back at, even though now it's just a collection of pixels. This is me. We're doing a feminist flash mob in the Delhi metro. We're claiming space for women. She goes on to the next photo. Here I am doing a bamboo dance with my Mizo friends. Can you believe it? Do I look like a Northeastern girl? Kunzas is referring to friends from Mizoram, a small state in India's northeast. Kunzas is laughing and charismatic. She's told us she had to struggle in Delhi and has been called racist slurs and wondered if she could ever succeed outside Ladakh. So many Ladakhis, when they go, their parents are investing so much time and effort and money for them to be able to go travel and go to college outside of Ladakh. Even if they're from families of quite modest means, people find ways to make this happen. But then in Delhi, in Mumbai, and other cities in India, they do experience racial discrimination because they're seen as being not quite of the nation, as I'll explain. So somehow it was hard to reconcile her self-doubt with her confidence, despite knowing so many other young people whose hardships have made them strong. Kunzas was using her favorite photographs to tell a room of other charismatic college students about her life in Delhi, while my collaborators, Mabel Gergen and Rinchin Dolma, and I watched from the sidelines. Religion, Ladakhi identity, gender, all these things were wrapped up in how Kunzas describes herself, but there's so much else going on as well that's just about her own idiosyncratic view of the world. She's fashioning a life and sense of self that fits the person she feels herself to be. And she's able to do this through her ability to move between family home, lay bazaar, and college campus, picking up new ways of being in the world. She wants to travel, go abroad, and see the world, but in the end, she wants to return to Ladakh. What will it all be for, she wonders, if she didn't come back to help her own people? Youth hold a particular place in the geopolitical imagination. In this chapter, young people describe their own geopolitical lives and futures. Parents' love as management, care as policing implicates the body and bodies as territory imbued with ethnic, religious, or national identity. But the body is also an intimate site through which we shape and are shaped by the world. Parents, grandparents, and community members work to protect and care for the young, as well as to instill in them a sense of who they are to carry that identity into the future. This could be encouraging people to marry among their own, speak Ladakhi, eat Ladakhi food, and so on. In preparation for an unknown future, we sometimes ask young people to participate in the promise of happiness, in Sarah Ahmed's terms, the idea that if you wish for the right things, your wishes will become true. But if you wish for the wrong things, the wrong people, or the wrong kind of life, you will languish and flail in an unfair world. Young people occupy a particular geopolitical position as the object of concern for older generations and as political actors in their own right. Understood as a vector into the future, young people become a way to manage the unknowable time to come, but they also chafe against the constraints engendered by this position. So in this chapter, we also return to this idea that geopolitical bodies have a physics, the sticking together fun of a flash mob that makes your feminism flesh, or the sudden feeling of city as a hostile space when a racial slur arrives unexpectedly and your body becomes a wish for home. But unruly bodies are also disciplined and managed in the aggregate, told individually at home to take care with those of the other religion. In the morning, a wave of parents dutifully shepherd their children into the white shirts, slacks, black ties, and black shoes of British inflected school uniform to learn to be on time, memorize, take exams in English, and compete on the other side of these mountains. They're preparing for a future through an education system that itself can't be disentangled from the imperial intimacies that applied notions of modernity and development, even as they work to foreclose the meanings of those words for colonized places. Simultaneously, in the lives of young people, striving, thriving, but also sometimes stumbling, there's the messy, lively life of the unbounded territory they desire. So this chapter asks what inhabiting a geopolitically charged body feels like for young people. And this draws on work that since 2011, I've been doing with Mabel Gergen with these young people who go to college. And you see here folks in Delhi. These are college students in Delhi who are staging a protest because of the neoliberalization of the flights of airlines means that the flights back home are too expensive and they basically can't return home. So they go to college, they can't return home. And here in particular, they're complaining that they can't go back home to vote because Ladakh, I didn't mention, but during winter, it's so high up in the mountains, the roads are closed and you actually can only fly in or out. So as Ladakhi parents send their children to major urban centers like Jammu, Chandigarh, and Delhi, or rarely abroad on scholarships, they socialize or even date across religious lines and also cultivate intentionally cosmopolitan subjectivities. But they also experience racialized discrimination. Local residents, peers, or teachers call them Nepali, Chinese, or racial slurs and point to their eyes or their sartorial style as evidence that they're not properly Indian. All these experiences are layered on a tangle of precarity emerging from ecological, economic, and political change that finds young people developing a sense of Ladakhiness in opposition to the world outside, but also policing one another's embodied performance of Ladakhi or religious identity. Let's see. Oh, I'll stay here. In the stories that parents and children have told me, place as a cultural phenomenon, as a sense of cultural practices in relation to where they play out, is tangled in an overlay of territory as an intensifying political determinant of the future. If territory, as I've argued here, has a demarcated and legal existence, but is also a lively and lived experience, what role will these young people play? So I'm trying to understand here what it feels like to live as a young person when your life is understood to be territorial. And especially I think about it in relation to generational vertigo, which is this idea I'm putting forward where folks see the future as this unknowable thing that must be managed and in ways that things get a little bit blurry. So you might have concerns about the economic future for your children that end up being tied to concerns about climate change, concerns about the border with Pakistan, and the political future of your place. So the sense of being Ladakhi in relation to one's own trajectory of space is both personal and geopolitical. And this comes out in all these different ways. So I'm thinking of, I talk here about an interview I did with two young women, Song Chuskit and Stanzan Angmo, who both study in the United States now and are applying for graduate programs, and asked to use their own names because they read the book and they were fine with how they come across. So they talked about going back and forth between Ladakh, Delhi, and the United States. And Tong Chuskit says, when Stanzan Angmo and I went to Delhi for 2 months before we went to the United States, when we were in Delhi, when we say we're Ladakhi, and then we explain that that's in Jammu and Kashmir. But then when we went to the United States, nobody knows Ladakh. So you say, I'm Indian. Oh, India. So when you go outside of the country, you feel more Indian, I think. And when you're inside India, you're like, no, I'm from Ladakh. And then Stanzan Angmo says, yeah, I'll say the same, but like when I went to the United States, I feel more Indian because they ask me about Modi or Gandhi or curry and everything. But whenever you say I'm from India, they're like, oh, you don't look Indian. And then Tong Chuskit tells this story of when we're coming back from the United States in Delhi airport, there was an Indian section and a section for foreigners. And we went in the Indian line with our passports and somebody said, oh, ma'am, you should go to that side. This side is for Indians. So they're talking about how they're moving through these different spaces and being read as Indian, not Indian, kind of Indian, Ladakhi, where's Ladakh? And they're trying to understand how this mobility kind of like changes how they themselves see themselves. They concluded their anecdote together laughing. We are Indians. The movement across these borders had told them who they were to the rest of the world. Later in the same conversation, students' descriptions of their experience of discrimination take a turn. Kunzas jumps in right away. We were in the minority. She's talking about studying in Delhi. We were in the minority. In my class, I was the only Ladakhi, and they were like, some people call us this racial slur. They call us that name. It's like, we don't feel good when someone calls us by a different name. We have our own personal name. And then Tashi Namgyal, the artist from earlier, interrupts. There's that same thing here too, you know. I think you go anywhere, the majority try to rule over the minority. Here, we call people Biharis or Nepalis in the same way. There's shitty people here too. And I'm getting close to wrapping up. Namgyal Angmo, who you see here, is familiar with concepts of Orientalism and othering and understands these to be the basis of colonial violence. When her teacher in Jammu stereotypes Ladakis, she's furious, lampooning the teacher as a credulous dolt who believes some nonsense she saw on the National Geographic Channel. At the same time, Namgyal like makes fun of stereotypes about Ladakis, but then she also tells me, I'm not fit to be Ladakhi. Because Ladakis by nature are quite shy, whereas I'm very boyish. I'm not that quiet girl. When she returns to Ladakh from urban India, she finds herself faltering, unable to become the furniture. She tells me, I can't play the role of daughter. I can't play the role of sister sometimes. There's not a fixed role for me anywhere. Here they're thinking I'm beyond normal. Heteronormative roles are very tough for me. That's why I can understand the problems of gays and homosexuals. I've only been to girls' school, girls' college, only girls, girls, girls. So maybe I want to be the boy among them. I'm trying to be the boy among them. So across interviews, Ladakhiness as a place-based identity emerges kind of tangled in a sense of self, not always in comfortable ways. So Namgyal feels like she has trouble fitting in Ladakh, but then she also tells me how she loves Ladakh and Ladakhis are gentle, honest, straightforward people. How if you go to a stranger's house in Ladakh, at least they'll give you a cup of tea and barley flour. Namgyal wants to define herself on her own terms. I know what Ladakhiness is within me. Clothes don't define you, culture can change. We need to think about the ethical nature of culture, the ethics of change. So we should be very secular. These are just some images from the zine. So I'm going to kind of wrap up and conclude here and then just ask if you want me to talk about the other things that I'm working on. So the ways that Shifa speaks about her own life and body and her refusal to be instrumentalized in a struggle for demographic territory resonate with countless conversations playing out in the place where I wrote most of this book, the US South. If this book is a time capsule, when I wrote the conclusion, migrants from Central America were traversing Mexico to seek asylum at the US border, while our then President Trump deployed troops to protect us from these women and children, talking about them as a security threat. At the same time, embodying refusal, women across the United States used their bodies and voices to try to prevent the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court following accusations of sexual assault. So these events were following the family separation crisis still unfolding, in which thousands of children were separated from their parents and caregivers at the US border as a deterrent to migrants and asylum seekers. And I see this as a moment in which we saw a kind of fictive white nation state being protected against this like threatening brown others through the dissolution of their kinship ties. So, you know, folks who were trying to migrate across the border weren't allowed to have kinship, while this kind of imaginary white fictive nation state was protected. The politics of the right in the United States have come to revolve around white demographic fever dreams in which the white majority is represented at risk. And this often unfolds through gendered visions of white women threatened by brown or black men, as we saw so often in Donald Trump's campaign. The violence that these logics engender point to intergenerational relations as geopolitical practice, as the maintenance of political logics between past and future. In the case of the United States, racial geopolitics have involved the manipulation or destruction of ties between parents and children as a means of protecting white supremacy, parallel to a celebration of childhood innocence for white people. Reintegrated across scales, the practices that transmit racial geopolitics are enmeshed in local manipulations of school districting, in the racial politics that play out in my own campus, and in the everyday experiences that my husband Tonya and I have raising our daughter in a predominantly white neighborhood and school district. When Shiva tells us that her life is her own, not property, she's refusing a colonial territorialization that emerges from broader territorial processes. Young people are taught that interreligious marriage is dangerous. Upon marriage, they hear conflicting points of view on whether contraception is ethically acceptable. Shifa's story is also grounded in the management of religious and moral boundaries through the disciplining of desire. New reproductive technologies, the medicalization of the body, and the emergence of a biopolitical state, all these enable new forms of bodily management. They also provide a new language for women to frame their reproductive history. Others have noted the pressure on women to embody national cultural identity through their sexuality and the role that the state plays in this process. Women are called to marry, dress, and comport themselves in ways that reflect well on the state and bode well for the upbringing of loyal and proper citizens. Their bodies are thus inseparable from and contiguous with the nation as cultural idea and state as manager of citizens. They're likewise called to exist in relation to first the natal and then the marital family. This process through which bodies are called in relation to the state and nation is, of course, as I say in more detail in the book, not particular or peculiar to South Asia, but the pattern that replicates and proliferates across the globe, particularly in the wake of empire and its racial formations. Young people in Ladakh are forging a future for themselves and for their place through their movement between the region and India's or the world's urban spaces, and through their embodied interactions with border guards, classmates, and landlords. Their assertions about the persons they want to become, about whom or whether they will marry, about what they owe their parents and their place of birth are also geopolitical statements that reflect their orientation to other bodies and to other places. So I have that as a conclusion. I have a couple slides that are kind of about how this fits in my larger body of work, but I feel like I talked enough for now, correct?
You actually know, I mean, you've got enough time. It's 10 to 8, so, and we sort of kicked off at about 10 past the hour. So if you wanted to talk about this more recent work, then yes, go ahead. That'd be fine.
Okay. I felt like I might have.
As long as you feel you've still got a voice. And
I'm fine. I just felt like I might have talked quite a bit for now, but I'll talk just a little briefly about how this fits into other things I've been working on.
Great.
As I said in the opening, I've been thinking about my overarching body of work as being about how people do tricks with time to claim and bound territory. So I talked about that today in terms of these first two, especially Intimate Geopolitics and Generational Vertigo. But I've also been thinking about this demographic fever dreams, Anthropocene as apocalypse, and this idea of the scene. So demographic fever dreams is a collaboration I've worked on with Banu Gokriksal, Chris Newbert, and then in a separate article with Carlos Serrano and Pavitra Vasudevan as well. And Banu, Chris, and I published on this in the feminist journal Signs. And in this work, let's see, where are my notes? This work started during the 2016 election season. So at that time in the United States, we saw this racist and territorial rhetoric that was used to kind of elide or obscure material realities of white class difference by focusing on an embodied nationalism and centering whiteness at risk, resulting in an election in which correlations between race and voting patterns were stark. So this demographic fever dream idea came when my PhD student, Chris Newbert, who works on masculinity and American farming, he posted this t-shirt on social media that said, "America needs lesbian farmers." And it was a postcard making fun of something Rush Limbaugh had said. So Rush Limbaugh is this kind of right-wing demagogue who recently passed away. And Rush Limbaugh had said that the Obama administration had a plot to take over rural America by populating it with queer farmers. So it's a funny idea, right? So there had been a conference for queer farmers that somehow the Obama administration gave a small amount of money to. And Limbaugh said they're trying to take over the whole country by filling the Midwest, traditionally Republican, with a bunch of queer farmers. And it's kind of a weird, funny idea. And so we were talking about how it's like a demographic fever dream. It's like this this idea that's so weird that it kind of sticks in your head. And then we started thinking about other versions of that, where there's something that's kind of so off that it kind of catches on because it's so peculiar. So that made me think about the idea of love jihad, which folks from the audience in India will be familiar with. So this is this idea that there's kind of Muslim men in India are out there being very kind of like sexy, seducing Hindu women and turning them into love bombs. That's like from one of the original pamphlets, and Veena Das has written some great work on this. So in this paper, we thought through these different kinds of demographic fever dreams. And then Banu writes about this in Turkey. And we're trying to think about demographic fever dreams as having four aspects. One is a vivid specificity that catches the imagination. So it's something really specific. So like the lesbian farmers, that catches the imagination. A seeming detachment from demographic data, but then an obsession with demography. So it's about demography, but there's no basis in demographic fact. And then finally, they often, but not always, include a very gendered representation of masculinity that's both weak and under threat, but also victorious, to a corollary kind of white or majority femininity that's in need of protection. So we wrote about that in Signs, and then we also wrote about this in relation to US migration politics. Okay, so in a different turn of thinking about the relations between tricks with time and territory, my notes here are like so out of order, you can't even imagine. Mabel Gergen and Pavitra Vasudevan and I talk about the ways that the future is imagined as apocalypse. And we put that in relation to different ideas for marking the beginning of the Anthropocene. So we think about specific forms of future apocalypse movies and how they tie up also to scientific imaginaries about the beginning of the Anthropocene. So there's a proposal to start the Anthropocene in the Industrial Revolution, and we map that onto kind of great deluge fantasies in which like New York is underwater. And then there's a proposal to tie the Anthropocene to radioactive fallout, the Great Acceleration. We tie that to nuclear Holocaust type apocalypse movies. And then there's a proposal to tie the beginning of the Anthropocene to the Orbis spike and the genocide in the Americas tied to settler colonialism. And we tie that to kind of zombie movies and the idea of the population bomb. The way that I'm putting this all together like this sounds a little bit chaotic, and the paper is a little bit chaotic, but just trust me, it makes a lot of a lot of sense. So I'm taking that work. Oh, and these are just some images from some of the ways that we were thinking about it. So we're talking about how discussions of the Anthropocene can mimic white panic about fears of a different, unrecognizable world. And so we also talk about like Public Enemies, Fear of a Black Planet, Cover, and so on, takes on that. So I'm taking that work forward now, working with my colleague, Andrew Curley, who's a Diné or a Navajo scholar. And we are looking at the scene, as we're calling it. We're looking at the ways that different kinds of ways of thinking about the Anthropocene, like the Capitalocene and the Plantationocene, we're asking why these have continued to center kind of Europe as site of agency and Western ways of dividing up time and space, instead of alternatively focus on kind of Black and Indigenous theorizations of history and global environmental change, which also account for things like colonialism and capitalism, but do so from a very different angle. So we're thinking that through in relation to the Navajo Nation in Arizona. Okay, so that's just a little bit of what I've been working on. I also put this up here just to say that I also recently co-edited a book with my colleagues, Vanugo Crixel, Mike Hawkins, and Chris Newbert. So that's Feminist Geography Unbound. So this is the rest of what I've been working on. And then I want to close by just saying thank you. So as you can tell from the work, I could never have done this without so much help in Ladakh. And in particular, I just wanted to name these folks. Dolma Tsering is my mother-in-law. I can't do anything without her. Then there's a bunch of local kind of folks and scholars who have helped me continuously, as well as all the young people we've worked with. And then I have these local collaborators, Manisha Ahmed, Tashi Morab, Rinchen Dolma, and Rixen Chodan, who I work with at the Ladakh Arts and Media Organization. And then finally, the youth part of this project was done with Mabel Garrigan. So this is such a goofy photo of us, but she said it's her favorite one of us. So that's why I always use this one. And you can look her up at Vanderbilt. She also looks at hydropower and environmental politics in Sikkim. So I will stop sharing then and be ready for any questions that y'all have.
Thank you, Sarah. That's absolutely amazing, and also a visual treat as well, because some of that, the images and the things that the young people have made themselves and your own designs are quite intriguing to look at. You probably saw I was putting my glasses on every so often, my reading glasses, to look closer. So thank you very, very much. We're open to questions. So the chat room is down here, and of course you can also do reactions. So you can raise your hand if you specifically want to ask a question, because you can just raise your hand and we can acknowledge you, and then you will be able to ask a question in person. But just so people have got a bit of time to sort of think and mull over what they've been doing, I've sort of thought of a few questions I want to ask, just to create a little bit of thinking time and space. I mean, there's so much to ask and to engage with and to find out more. I mean, just a kind of simple question to begin with of things is, one of the things that struck me in all of the images that the young people were putting together, and particularly the zines and so forth, was the real brightness around colour. And it struck me how different that was to the photograph of Lei, and how grey and brown and just some bits of green in the back. So I just wondered if culturally that colour, and particularly bright colour, is seen as something that's important and meaningful.
That's funny. I have never thought about it that way, actually. So I'm kind of, I mean, Ladakh is a place where I'm struggling to answer the question. Like, Ladakh is a place where it's, I don't know how to think about color. Like, it's, like you said, it's a place where there's this backdrop of often quite subtle colors of the mountains, but then we have this crazy blue sky there. You know, it seems really, maybe it's the altitude, it feels really blue. And then the villages are kind of like this emerald green that just like, you know, startles you almost when you see it from the sky. I guess I'm thinking of Ladakh in summer, and I think that photo, no, there's some green still there. So like in winter, it's much more, you don't have that green. I don't know. I guess I hadn't really thought of that. I think what comes to mind in those images in particular is the ways that some folks, especially Tashi Namgyal, were, the ways that they encounter India, like outside of Ladakh, as being sort of this exotic destination. So like when a lot of the Ladakhi college kids I talk to, when they talk about India, I'm often struck by how they describe it just like a Western tourist does. So they'll say, you know, oh, I went to this one student told me, I went to Jammu and I was so hot. Even my hands were hot, Sarah. And they say, you know, the food was like too spicy for me. I got sick. The city was so busy and chaotic. And I'm thinking in my head, like, oh, you sound like one of the European tourists, you know, because there's this feeling that you cross the mountains and you kind of go into a different world, even though it's your world, like you're from India. So I do think some of the pictures that you're thinking of are also students being kind of excited about the kind of color of India itself, like almost taking tourist type pictures of it. So I feel like we see that a little bit, but I don't have a really good answer to your question. I want to think about it more.
Okay, thank you. I can see that Lisa has put her name into the chat room. Does this mean you have a question, Lisa? And if so, would you like to unmute?
I know somebody named Nilza, but I don't think it's that Nilza Angmo. I know another Nilza Angmo.
Nilza, do you want to say anything? If you want to unmute, you can ask. Okay. There's a question come up in the chat from Bala, and then after that, Jessica has raised her hand. So we'll look at the question. So Bala asks, I'll read it out so everybody, in case they can't read it. So Bala says, thanks for an interesting talk about your book. I found the insights about the changing identities of migrant students particularly interesting. I'm wondering what sort of geopolitics the youth who stay back in Leh and do not migrate for education. I'm just wondering, asking, what about their experience? Do they feel disadvantaged in relation to their more mobile counterparts? And would they have different aspirations than the youth who migrate? There's different sections of the question there. So the first one is about what sort of geopolitics the youth who remain in Leh, what kind of politics do they experience? That might be the first one.
Yes, that's such a great question. And this is something I think about a lot. And I'm hoping to know more about in the coming year, because we're just started working with this survey data that Rinchen Chodan has helped us to do. Rinchen Chodan and Rinchen Dolma have helped us to do a survey. And one of the things they did is they went to more distant villages that we're thinking fewer folks have sent their kids from. So in Leh, almost everyone is trying to send their kids outside of Leh if they can. But then from some of the villages, it's more difficult for folks. And we do think a lot, and the young college kids that I talk to also talk about this as a kind of growing divide, because it can intensify class difference in all the ways that you would expect in terms of access to jobs and access to upward mobility. So we've just done a survey of about almost 300 households trying to understand whose children are getting sent. And also of those who are getting sent, like, are folks returning or are they staying outside? And I do think that it's becoming a disadvantage, because the same thing as we see in other parts of the world, there's this sort of expectation that you have to get a college degree, you have to have upper level education to get even kind of lower level government posts, or to get education. And then also in Ladakh, we don't have there's now a degree college, but there's not yet a full-fledged university. It's kind of in the works. So then folks can't move all the way through higher education without leaving. So I think that they are definitely disadvantaged, and it shapes their kind of economic prospect and runs the risk of there being kind of more of a split. That being said, it's really surprising the degree to which families of modest means manage to send their kids outside, because I've been kind of surprised by that. And that's also coming through in this survey, because even folks who don't have a lot of cash income, they kind of do work like going out to work on the roads. Roads are always having to be built and rebuilt in Ladakh because of the weather. So they go out and work on the roads, or they like sell milk from the cow, or they find all these different means to like draw on extended family networks to send their kids to school in ways that are kind of interesting, and come across in ways that I feel like there's a overly simplistic narrative coming out of India about like who does and doesn't go to school. So like there's a real emphasis on educating young women, for instance, to the extent that I feel like young women end up going to college more than young men. This is kind of an answer around your question. I think the simplest answer is yes, that they do feel disadvantaged, and that there's the risk of this kind of intensifying class difference. Nilza. Yeah, I thought Nilza Ang was such a Ladakhi name. That's so nice. I'm glad that you can come. Thanks for coming. That's really nice.
Sorry, just realized. Yes, it's okay. Do you want to look at Nilsa's question, because she typed it up there? Have you been able to read it? Okay.
I was. Should I state it for everyone, or will? Sorry, I'm talking over you. Should I state it for everyone, or will everyone have read it?
I can read it out. That's what we usually do. So it says, my question is that even as this idea, women's body as a territory is quite prevalent in the Ladakh region. What do you think about this prevalent idea of Ladakh being very equal gender-wise? Even if you ask a girl or woman in Leh, they'll answer that we are equal to men in Ladakh. So what are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I just, yeah, I think that we could talk for like an hour about this because I think it's such a good question. I mean, so for folks who aren't from the Ladakhi context, which is maybe most folks, but except for Nilzal, so folks who aren't from there, we have this idea that that some places like in the Northeast and Ladakh, that there's kind of gender equality. And people will point to all different kinds of things to say that. So in Ladakh, for instance, there's an old tradition of polyandry. So the first time I went to Ladakh, I lived with a family for 3 months in Thiang, and it was a polyandrous family. So it's like one woman is married to 2 brothers, and one brother works outside the home, and the other brother is kind of home to work on the farm, and it's like a very practical system. And there's also the case that sometimes women are married into man's house most of the time, like bakma kyangches, but then there's also makba kyangches where the man marries into the woman's house and then he becomes part of that family. This is with Buddhists. So there's also this idea that, yeah, just that there's more gender equality in Ladakh. But as Nilza is hinting at, I mean, it's really complicated because patriarchy is everywhere, isn't it? So I feel like I absolutely see that. Like we see that in the case, and this was discussed a lot in recent elections, where are the women running for office, or why aren't women being kind of put forward to run for office? And where are they in like different kinds of leadership positions? So it's really true that we have women who have strong leadership roles. So I guess I didn't say this directly, but my husband is Ladakhi and my mother-in-law is used to head the Ladakh Women's Alliance and is like, this very like outspoken, speaking up kind of a person. And we have so many women like that in Ladakh who kind of are very assertive and have a public voice. But then we also have an absence of women in leadership, and we have some of the same kind of gender issues in the home that you see elsewhere in the world. So I feel like it does get overstated. I mean, I also feel like as an outsider, I feel like some anxiety about speaking too much to that issue. But I will say that for me, I experience patriarchy in the US kind of very similar to how I experience it in Ladakh. Like there's some families, like my sister-in-law has this very progressive husband where the kid stays home with him, she goes to work, she goes to the village, kids are with him, he helps make dinner, he helps with everything. So their family is like a little gender paradise, but then you could go in another family and it's quite different. So I feel like everywhere we're kind of grappling with these questions. And then I did sometimes run into that. I'm talking too much to this question, but I've already started. I did also run into that in just talking to women about reproductive health. So this like very respected folks will kind of, there's this idea that you should learn about reproductive health when you have your first baby. So that's very difficult for young women who are like coming into adolescence and coming into being a young woman, and there's no space or place for them to learn about these issues. And that's something that's really important to Soang Chuskit, who I mentioned earlier, and she's been doing some work in Changtang especially on this issue. So I think that it is an issue, but then there's so many inspiring young Ladakhi women who are kind of taking this up. So I'm excited to see what happens in the coming years. That was a lot for that. I'm so sorry.
Thank you, but very interesting. So thanks for that. So Jessica's first. She has written a statement, but I think it sort of goes to ETC. So I'm going to ask Jessica if she wants to ask it in person.
I can. Sorry, I don't have long. I have to leave in a minute. Sarah, it was a great talk, and I loved your use of art mixed in. Yeah, and I could tell it's a place close to your heart in many ways. But I guess I was interested in, you were talking about sort of one of your broader and future topics is understanding this apocalyptic future. Yet Tracy's mentioning of the really bright art made things seem quite hopeful, as well as blue skies. But also that young people are going into new pathways, right? They're becoming more educated, they're going to different places despite challenges when they go. But are you asking young people about what forms these negative ideas about the future, or are they ideas coming from other people? And I was wondering what common themes are forming the apocalypse.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I can speak to that in two ways. Like, I think with the one about apocalypse, we were mostly looking at kind of pop culture and thinking about it in that sort of realm of like cultural productions of apocalypse. But this is also something that I talk to young people about. Just I always ask them how they're thinking about the future and what they want for the future of Ladakh. And it's just such a complex question because one thing I think about quite a bit, and this was a big topic of conversation last time Mabel and I had a workshop with young people, was about the ways that Ladakhis, Ladakh is a very, I don't know how to say this, it's a very lovable place. It's like very, when you fly and you land there, you feel like you're in a really different world. And young people speak about that too. They speak about how beautiful the villages are. So Tashi Namgyal talked to me about how he goes to Delhi and he feels like the water is polluted. You get this kind of black stuff in your nose, and it's this feeling. And then when he's there, how he's thinking about Ladakh and how like he just wants to go to a stream in Ladakh and just lie down on the bank of the stream and just put his face in it and just drink straight out of the stream, and how he never wants that to change. So there's this way that young people, they have this connection to that feeling of the Ladakhi village, and they really want the Ladakhi village to stay the Ladakhi village. But then Ladakhi villages right now are full of, older folks whose like knees hurt and elbows hurt because they're trying to maintain the farm all on their own. And young people can't really afford to come back. And also coming back, they feel awkward. They feel like, I don't even know how to do all of these tasks. And we need like a cash income that farming can't provide. So there's this complicated feeling of like, at the same time, this same person will tell me, how much he loved going to Varanasi and how he loves going to art museums and he loves urban life. But then he also wants, in some ways, like the way that Mabel and I have been talking about it in a recent paper, is the ways that young people in some ways want to keep Ladakh as it is. They don't want a kind of, because they view the urban almost as apocalyptic. They'll talk about how people will like lie to you about prices or how it's like this and that kind of challenges in the city. And then how they go back to Ladakh and they feel so comfortable. But then they also want to live as urban people, but back in Ladakh. So it's kind of like these irreconcilable or these difficult to reconcile things where they want to come back and they want to be, gender queer, or they want to, have a girlfriend they're not going to marry. But then they still want the village, they want that emerald barley field too. So they're kind of talking about these different futures. I don't know if that really answered.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So we've got various things going on in different places across the board about people with questions. So Manusha is next. She's raised her hand, and so she will ask her question. Then after her, we have Gaurav, and we'll either look at his question of where it's typed up, or he can ask the question himself. And also, thirdly, after that is Erica has some engagement with you as well. So we'll start with Manusha, go to Gaurav, and then we'll go to Erica. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for these great questions.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for the fascinating talk. It was really interesting. And, you know, this is sort of a thought that came to my mind while I was listening to your response to Nilsa's question. So you were talking about, you know, how, you know, the individual, especially gender, individual identity, and how that sort of is in disjunction with sort of the community identity, and your explanation, and also partially to what you were saying with Jessica. It resonated with other Buddhist communities as well. So I'm from Sri Lanka, so where Sri Lanka has this huge tension right now between the Buddhists and the Muslim population, and also it's very similarly a very matrilineal society. You do have similar patterns as you were you know, discussing. So again, I was just wondering whether you could say a bit more about, you know, you did answer it partly to Jessica's question, but, you know, how do people have this tension between, you know, the individual, you know, the independent woman, the feminist woman, which families want to maintain, but also they seem to have this romanticized idea. So I was wondering whether there's this sort of way in which people automatically manage shift back and forth scales. Like sometimes they select to have this idea, this is what what's guiding our decisions, but at the same time doing this. So this, I'm personally also grappling with how to make sense of this sort of behavior which I see taking place. So
yeah. Do you mean in the sense that we have this ideal, like there's an ideal of kind of the Ladakhi woman as being like a Ladakhi woman as being like this, but then we also see kind of complications in how that relates to people's individual lives?
Partly, but there's also these certain ideologies that are becoming prominent. So there's the you know, Ladakhi women need to be more independent. That's a positive thing. It is seen as positive, but at the same time, this is also a risk to the typical Ladakhi culture as well. So the fact that there is a tension there, but still people seem to be able to, they go back and forth between this.
Yeah, no, I just kind of, I just really agree with you. There is this way that, I mean, I guess it's complicated like in all places. Like I feel like there's a way that women are strong and they're expected to be strong. And they're kind of like idealized in that way. But then it's in kind of certain times and certain places, then all of a sudden it kind of becomes a barrier. And this has been a big conversation, as I hinted earlier. For instance, I mean, this year has been really strange because I haven't been able to go back because of pandemic. So I feel like kind of out of touch. But then one of the things that kind of I saw coming up repeatedly on social media was this kind of question, like we're known for having this kind of strong Ladakhi women, but then we don't so much see them in political positions, or there's these spaces where, you know, the Hill Council, we don't see them, like the local autonomous government. And people have also been raising this in kind of articles or like in journalism, talking about, you know, we say this, but then we all know that patriarchy really still exists. Actually, I have a different zine page about that I didn't show here, where somebody has written like, is there patriarchy in lay? And then they've kind of like put these different examples. So we see that happening, and then we see young people like Namgyal Angmo is a really good example. This young woman who's kind of saying how she kind of sees herself as a boy among the girls, sort of chafing at the constraints that do exist. Like I also thought of another person that I interviewed who was telling me how, I don't know, this sort of poignant story that always Mabel and I like, I don't know, we were thinking about it. It was like kind of bringing tears to our eyes because it's relatable. This woman told us how, you know, she went to Delhi and she went to Bangalore and she was studying in different places in India. And then she came back to Ladakh, and she's back in Ladakh and she's in her family home, and she's supposed to be home at 8. And it's kind of expected of her. And then she's been like in all these cities where her family doesn't know what she was up to. And she's home at 8 and she just feels like, I just want to walk around at night. And she's like, even in the cities, I didn't do it. And even like back in Leh, I didn't do it. But I just picture myself just walking in the darkness at night by myself. And this is, you know, something that's so familiar. I think like when I tell college kids here in UNC this story, then the women are all like, yes, I too want to just walk at night. And so I feel like there's this way that there's this kind of like, I guess that's one of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of like where we have these desires and then our will to kind of manifest these desires can kind of make changes in society. And we see this, I mean, when I'm talking about this issue, I just want to shout out to like Why Loiter. There's a book and then there's also a collective that you can look up where they've written about this, especially in Mumbai. And it's about women making a call for loitering, like to be in public, not to do anything. You can also see that with the activist Blank Noise, where they organize some campaigns to just like meet in public parks and take naps, which is a very gendered activity. So I don't know, I guess that's the answer to my question, is that we see these tensions. And then I also see young women doing so many kinds of different ways that they're kind of reshaping their lives accordingly.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm going to, as chair, I'm going to have to intervene a little bit because we're coming up to the end of the time of the talk.
Yeah, I'm talking a lot for each question.
Yeah, so if you can synthesize it down a bit.
I will.
And I understand, because when you know so much about something, it's important. So Gaurav, if it's okay with you, I'll just read your piece out. So Gaurav said thanks for the wonderful talk. He wants to ask if the geopolitical tensions that you discuss in the region are specifically religion-based, or have you also come across other geopolitical tensions, for example, between Ladakhi and Tibetan identities? Okay.
Yes, and I'm going to be focused now.
There's Erica and somebody else.
Yeah, I told you I'm a very talkative person. That's such a great question. So I feel like there's a difference. And Tanya and I have talked about this too with me. Like, for instance, I'm this like foreign weirdo and I'm married into a Ladakhi family and it doesn't have like a geopolitical charge. So we've talked about the ways that specific identities come to have this like geopolitical charge. So I feel like with the Tibetans, we have lots of Tibetans living in Ladakh, but I feel like they're not viewed as a geopolitical threat, but rather it's kind of like sometimes there's economic tensions. Like, do they like the spaces they occupy in the market and so on, but it doesn't have that same geopolitical nuance that you get between the religious identities. And I would tie this to the implications of British colonialism and partition and kind of the way that has played out in the region. That's a great question, but I'm trying to keep it short now.
That was a very good response as well. So after Gaurav, we had Erica. Erica, do you want to ask your question or do you want me to read it? Oh, there you are, great.
Hi. So thank you so much for your presentation. I just wanted to say that your concept of intimate geopolitics has been really useful for me to think through some concerns that youth have in my own research in a majority Christian area of Indonesia, where there's lots of discourses about Christian and Muslim socializing, dating, and relationships. And I'm wondering, you touched on it briefly in relation to the education system, but I'm wondering if you could expand on the role that local schools and maybe also like a national level curriculum play in circulating these discourses about the dangers of interreligious marriage and, what you talked about as disciplining desire, and whether there are any kind of prevalent counter discourses about interreligious marriage as showing some kind of commitment to desire, and if those are sort of also circulated by this education system, or if they're more kind of on an individual level.
Yeah, so I think that it's not, thanks so much for your question. Yeah, that's great. I think that it's not so much through the schools, though I do think that schools play some bit of a role in that folks often enroll their kids in private schools, and then some of the schools are like there's two main Muslim schools in Leh and one main Buddhist school, and then there's a bunch of ones that don't have kind of aren't seen as having a religious orientation. So I did suspect that plays somewhat of a role just in kind of separating people, but then there's a decent number of folks who go to, like Buddhists who go to the Muslim school and vice versa for practical reasons. And I don't think it's so much the curriculum. I really think mostly it's things that happen in the home where folks are kind of told that they need to be like really properly Buddhist in this way or really properly Muslim in this way, and that means a certain number of things. At the same time, there's absolutely a counter discourse, but it's just really complicated. So like folks will speak really nostalgically about like, oh yeah, in the past we used to marry each other and it was no problem. And then I would say like, so would you let your daughter marry a Muslim? And they would be like, no, of course not. Like I would like drag her back home. So it's this complicated thing where people do tell me, this does come to education, that, you know, because we're now educated, because we're now modern, we can't act like that anyway. Like we used to in the past. Like we didn't know our faith, we didn't know religion, we weren't properly Buddhist, we weren't properly Muslim, and that explains our past behavior.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That whole discussion, isn't it, around what faith comes to mean in different geopolitical contexts, and how it flows through and flows out again, and the idea that you didn't know how you could be religious or not,
Right.
and suddenly you've got to, you know, it's got to be a leading factor.
Yeah, but young people will, I mean, I should have said, I'll keep this really close. Young people will say, like, under the Indian constitution, I have a right to marry someone of a different faith. So, like, there is that as a counter narrative also. So it's complicated.
Right, okay, so then we've got Magda's question. Magda, do you want to speak for yourself, or should I read it out? If you want to unmute, do so. I'm happy to read it. I think she's still, okay. So Magda's saying that she said, thanks for a great talk. I was wondering what impact, if any, the recent administrative changes you think may have on issues you're discussing, especially the Muslim Buddhist relations, which in some ways I think you've explored a bit already in previous questions.
Yeah, this one is very, oh my goodness, it's just very, so much is happening now. And then it's been this strange time where like usually I would have been back for 2 months in the summer. So I'm seeing most of this through like WhatsApp conversations and like social media. What I see is that there's a real feeling from Kargilis. So Kargil is the district that's smaller and is mostly Shia majority, and then Leh is the district that's mostly Buddhist majority. And the two of them are together now, they're a union territory, which Buddhists had been trying to get a union territory for decades, with some Muslim support and some Muslims being concerned that once you have union territory, the Buddhists are going to be in charge and they're going to be kind of overrun. And then all those things are kind of playing out just right now, where Kargil, the mostly Muslim district, feels like it's now kind of like under the Buddhist administration, and Leh has more economic power. So there's complaints about kind of allocations of resources. And there's a way that like getting union territory, like it was this momentous moment where when everything was declared that Ladakh was going to be a union territory, at the same time Srinagar went into like lockdown, it's blacked out, there's no news coming out of Srinagar. In Ladakh, there's a party in the street, like literally a party in the street. So it's just kind of this geopolitical reconfiguration that's like ongoing, and I don't feel confident saying how it's gonna, I have concerns about how it's going to shift the relationship, and I feel like it could lead to an escalation of tensions, which I hope doesn't happen, but there's little signals that is happening.
Okay, we're just going to have time for Shritama. Sorry, I've just lost my chat. There it is. Okay, it's coming up on the screen. So Shritama's very patiently waiting at the end of the thing, and this will be the last one. But so she says, Dr. Smith, thanks so much for your illuminating talk and the really interesting use of art. I refer to your comments on women's bodies being seen as a territorial marker in terms of the culture they embody. Can you share any observations you might have about the male population there? Mm-hmm. How are the men there perceived, and what role do they play in terms of the way they embody a cultural identity? And she also asks about if there's a gender disparity in the way young girls and boys are perceived as a sort of bridge between the generations. So one is about the male population and the way men are perceived, and then this generation. Thank you. And then this will be the last one.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, so I think as you saw in the talk, like a lot of my interviews draw on conversations with women, just because the topics are so kind of intimate and personal, it looks really awkward for me to be asking men about them. But I do see ways that I feel like they chafe against some of the same restrictions, like some of the same complaints that there's sort of like you can't really be friends across gender without it coming across as sort of being a potential romance and then being kind of being a threat to like interreligious harmony. So they're facing like many of those same constraints. I do think that they're seeing, trying to think of other ways I can think about it. Like I feel like they're not talked about in exactly the same way just because of the gendered nature of how folks talk about these things. So for instance, people say, you know, they're taking all of our women. They don't say like, oh, their women are taking all of our men. So it kind of like gets framed in these different ways as like who gets taken and who is the taker. So at the same time, I don't feel like it's discussed in the same ways as, say, the love jihad exactly in India, like in terms of the sense of kind of like, I mean, maybe there's a way that Muslim men are portrayed a little bit as a threat, but I don't think it's quite in the same manner as we see elsewhere in India, where it can be really heightened. In terms of the way folks are perceived as a bridge between the generations, I do feel like I feel like both are expected to kind of like be Ladakhi in a specific way, but that maybe there's a slight more emphasis on that for women, as I think we see in a lot of places. Like often there's just more emphasis on like women's dress and comportment and those kinds of things. But that's not to say, I don't want to make it absolutist, because I do think that men get caught up in those discourses as well.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and thank you everybody for excellent questions. Also,
These were
for being
wonderful
here.
questions. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we've got them in print, and of course they've been recorded, which is the great value of this. So you've got time to sort of think through and reflect. But Sarah, thank you so much for an excellent discussion and presentation and sparking off so many ideas. We really appreciate you being here. I'd like you to just stay in the meeting a little bit longer, and then people will be saying sort of goodbye either in print or in person. Sure. So thanks again, and it would normally be a huge round of applause. So I'll do it for everybody else.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry that it wasn't in person, but I really appreciate the invitation, and I appreciate everyone's thoughtful questions, because sometimes you get questions that are really off base, but these have all been spectacular questions.
Great, good. Thank you very much. And thanks very much to the audience, and do have a good rest of the evening this Friday.